Good morning, everybody. A very warm welcome from the EPC to this discussion that is going to be looking at Turkish policy towards Russia's invasion of Ukraine, how Turkey is managing its relations with both parties, and Turkey's attempts at mediating the two parties in an attempt to find a solution to this really barbaric war. And we are joined by a great panel this morning to talk about these issues. First of all, Meltem Müftüler-Baç, who is Dean of Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, as well as Professor of International Relations and Jean Monnet Chair at Sabanci University. Ian Lesser, who is Vice President of the German Marshall Fund. And last but not least, Luigi Scazzieri, Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for European Reform in London. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us. To the audience, thank you very much for joining us for this important discussion. I would like to just remind everybody you can put your questions and comments to our speakers, either by clicking on the raise hand icon. It's always nice to hear different voices, or you can put it in the question and the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So I want to immediately kick off this discussion, and I'd like to start with you, Meltem. If you could give us your assessment of Turkey's policy, or maybe I should say Turkey, as we're all supposed to say now, policy towards Russia's invasion of Ukraine, how you see this, and the impact so far on Turkey. What impact has there been? And do you see it really possible that Turkey is able to continue with what's been defined as a sort of balancing act? I mean, Turkey has good relations with Russia and with Ukraine, and it's been able to maintain that so far, but is this sustainable? So I'll give you the floor now. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Amanda. It's great to be here. Can I just also add something before I answer your question? When Amanda sent me the invitation, I said, well, I'm hardly the person to actually talk because I do Turkish foreign policy and Turkey's relations with the EU, but we have a lot of people who actually work on Turkey and Russia and Ukraine. So most of the answers that I have, in response to the questions you are posing, are going to be relating more to the general principles of Turkish foreign policy and Turkey's position in the European order. Well, from the very beginning, I think everyone that is in the panel and in the audience, I'm sure they're already aware of it, is the fact that Turkey started from the very beginning when the signals came actually that something was in the books about a Russian intention to do some kind of use of force or invasion before it actually happened in Ukraine. Turkey tried to jump in and prevent this by attempting to mediate. Erdogan visited Ukraine at the beginning of February to send a very strong, credible signal. And when the actual operation, the invasion began, I think Turkey found itself in a very hard place. So one of the things that we can actually underline is that unlike some of the, let's say, NATO members and European Union members, which Turkey, of course, is not, the Turkish position is even more delicate compared to all of them, precisely because of the level of interdependence that we have with Russia on the one hand, and very good relations with Ukraine on the other hand. So that, more or less meant that it had to be a very, careful, planned, detailed response to what was happening. And at the very same time, it also meant that, Turkey had to signal in a very strong way that they were on the side of the Ukrainian sovereignty. At the very beginning of the invasion, there was this very public statement that, Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity cannot be touched. and the Turkish government is actually in favor of protecting all of that. And one of the first things that Turkey found itself, doing is implement the Monroe Convention, prevent the Black Sea to be utilized in the, war, in a very similar situation that Turkey found itself in 2008 with the Russian intervention in Georgia. But those, came one after another in a very quick manner, and the Turkish government had to handle the crisis in a way that would not harm its, economic and security interests on the one hand, and then, fulfill its commitments, of course, as a NATO member on the other hand. And the fact that it was just, in the middle, found itself in the middle of these two parties made it a very delicate situation. So I think so far, I'm not going into the mediation attempts at all, because I'm assuming that you will come to them later on. The Turkish position was, very clear. This is an unacceptable use of force. Turkey is, against any kind of use of force against another sovereign state, and that by implementing Monroe, it was able to signal that it's on an equal distance to both parties in terms of the war effort, but it is, also transforming itself into a, third party within which the Ukrainian and Russian counterparts could come, as we have seen in Antalya last month, when both of us were there, on a neutral ground where some kind of conversation would have been possible. So I'll just, leave it there, because I know you have more questions.
Thank you very much, Meltem. I'd now like to turn to you, Ian, to more or less ask you, the same question. I mean, how do you think that Turkey has managed so far very successfully to keep this balance? I mean, as was already mentioned, they've supported Ukraine's territorial integrity, they've stood with their NATO allies, but at the same time, Turkey hasn't, which was to be expected, it hasn't put sanctions on Russia. It's still doing business with Russia. I think that Roman Abramovich has just purchased a new football club in Russia. I mean, how do you see this, and how is this seen from Washington?
Well, Amanda, thank you. It's good to be with you. I agree very much with the way Meltem has laid this out. I mean, Turkey is obviously in a delicate position for all the reasons she described. I mean, Turkey is a full stakeholder in this crisis, in this war, in terms of its outcome, because it's a key stakeholder in security in and around the Black Sea, and has relations with both countries of different kinds, and also the connection to NATO, obviously. I think in a sense, Turkey is trying to have a kind of equal distance. I don't think that's sustainable, actually, for a number of reasons. You just can't have it both ways, ultimately. If this was a short, quick crisis, perhaps you could. But my judgment is that this is a very long-term confrontation with a very much more aggressive Russia. And there'll be I see very little way of extracting us from that without a regime change in Moscow, to use that term. And I'm not sure that's very likely. So, I mean, Russia is going to be a pariah state for a long time to come. There will be a deepening confrontation between NATO and Russia with all the things that come with that. And ongoing risks. And Turkey is highly exposed, it seems to me. So, just to get back to this question of whether it's sustainable, Turkey has multiple places where it can get into trouble with Russia. And in fact, this has happened in the past, but it happened under more benign conditions. I mean, imagine the 2015 shoot down of the Russian aircraft taking place again today under these conditions. It might not end the same way. And there's a potential for that in the Caucasus, in the Black Sea, Syria, Libya, Eastern Mediterranean. There are lots of places where Russia and Turkey can get into trouble, even accidentally. And that would have different implications today. I mean, that's a near term, that's an immediate problem. The other problem, of course, is that, Turkey may, and this was already visible before the war, be looking to moderate its posture towards Western partners for all sorts of reasons. That some of that has happened. so to your question, Amanda, about whether this will make a difference in relations with the United States, well, I do think Turkey over the longer term is going to have to, in a sense, come back to its NATO ties for its own deterrence and defense in this environment. But this is going to be won't translate automatically into a better relationship with the United States. And the issue of sanctions, which you've mentioned, will be central. Turkey, for example, wants to have access to upgraded F-16s from the United States now, quite apart from getting back into the F-35 program. I can't imagine that happening if in Congress there are questions about what Turkey's doing over sanctions on Russia. Not just not implementing them, but in fact, potentially actively allowing Russia to avoid them, to bypass them. This was the case with Iran and Iraq. It could be even more inflammatory on Capitol Hill now. So there are lots of reasons why Turkey, I think, ought to be, sort of looking to restore its credibility with NATO partners, and that may happen to an extent. But as this goes on, I think the dilemmas for Turkey will get tougher and tougher.
Thank you, Ian. Maybe I can just ask you a follow-on question. If I understood correctly on the sanctions issue, this would mean that there isn't a lot of understanding in the longer term towards the problems that would emanate to Turkey from Russia in the event that they would put sanctions on. Because as you mentioned, Turkey has, economic ties, this policy in Syria and whatnot, which could have serious ramifications actually for the country in the event that they would put up ties, not to mention the fact that Turkey is engaged in this mediation process. It's difficult to be a mediator if you're sanctioning one of the parties.
True. No, well, I don't think Turkey is a mediator. I think Turkey is a very effective facilitator of discussions that are important. But I think, whether these discussions succeed or fail, these negotiations between Ukraine and Russia succeed or fail, will have little to do with Turkey's role, it seems to me. Turkey is a venue. It's very important. I don't think it goes much beyond that, although it would be nice. I think on the sanctions side, Turkey is allergic to sanctions out of its own experience and history. They're not alone in the world in that. They may even be right in terms of their judgment about their effectiveness, but that's not the situation we find ourselves in at the moment. And the sanctions are a major vehicle for Western cohesion around this war. And if Turkey is not part of that, it's going to be very problematic to explain that away, it seems to me. I understand the Turkish stakes and why Turkey has a different perspective. I just don't think it's going to be easy to dismiss that whole piece when it comes to relations with Washington, or for that matter, with Brussels.
Can I just jump in very quickly, Amanda? Very, very quickly, just a small note. Turkey has participated in the sanctions against, let's say, Iraq in 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait, because there was a UN resolution and a UN mandate. So part of the current situation is the absence of a UN mandate. So I think the situation would be different if the United Nations could pass a resolution on that. Then the discussion could go in a different direction.
Yeah. And of course, Turkey is, I'm sorry, I know you want to move on, Amanda, but of course, Turkey is not the only one with these kinds of dilemmas. Even inside Europe, especially when you come to the energy piece of this, there are a lot of complicated debates going on in Europe about this, not least in Germany. So, this isn't unique to Turkey, of course, but as far as the US perception is concerned, it's not going to be popular.
Okay, thank you, Ian. I'm going to come back to some of these points again a bit later, but I want to give the floor now to Luigi. You've been working on Turkey for many years, including on Turkey EU relations. So it'd be good to get your insights into how you see the role of Turkey, but also perhaps how you see it impacting Turkey's relationship with the EU, which has been in trouble for many years. They seem to be going through a calmer moment at the moment. So what does this mean? Could it bring about a change in relations?
Well, thank you very much, Amanda, for inviting me. and for the interesting presentations that I just heard. In terms of characterizing Turkey's role, I would agree with Ian's characterization of Turkey as a facilitator rather than a mediator in terms of what it's doing, because Turkey doesn't have specific leverage to push either Ukraine or Russia towards a compromise. So what it's doing is acting to try to bring them together in a neutral way. In terms of how the EU has seen Turkey's actions, I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine has come at a time when Turkey-EU relations were improving, in a sense. After the very high tensions of 2020, there had been a marked decrease in 21, and also Turkey, as part of a broader shift in Turkish foreign policy, with Turkey improving relations with many of its other neighbors, or trying to, and de-escalating tensions with the US. And I think these developments had improved Turkey's image in the EU, at least to some degree already. And Turkey's response, that there's been appreciation for Turkish mediation efforts. There's been appreciation for Turkish support for Ukraine, also military support with the Bayraktar drones that have made a significant difference to fighting, I think, at least in the assessment that Ukrainians give. You know, there's also, what I find striking is that whereas, for instance, France or Macron is heavily criticized for trying to mediate or to facilitate dialogue between Ukraine and Russia, also prior to the invasion, Erdogan hasn't come under the same sort of criticism, even from states that are normally very critical of this. I think one visible sign of rapprochement has been the intensified dialogue between many EU countries and Turkey, with several EU leaders visiting Turkey in the past few weeks. And also, I was very struck by Macron's proposal, which didn't actually come to anything, but it was still very important, of working together with Greece and Turkey for a potential evacuation of Mariupol. Very important also, considering that, you know, those were the two member states that had the most problematic relation with Turkey in 2020. At the same time, you know, as has been hinted, I think Turkey isn't quite playing the role that the EU would ideally like it to play, in the sense that ideally there would be some alignment with sanctions, but there is understanding so far for Turkey's difficult position and for its links with Russia, not least in the security field, and the fear that Turkey has that Moscow might retaliate in the fields that we've heard. Turkey's move to close the straits is also, I think, slightly ambiguous in some ways, in the sense that in theory, Turkey closed the straits to traffic from to warships from all countries, and not just Turkish or Ukrainian. But, you know, so far Turkey hasn't come under substantial pressure from its allies. I think there's a lot of understanding. The question is how long this can last, as has been hinted at. You know, in terms of how this affects Turkey's relation with the EU, I think right now we can say that it improves the mood. It creates perhaps a small opening for better relations. You know, from Turkey's perspective, I suppose, NATO looks like a more important security guarantee in virtue of Russia being more and more aggressive. At the same time, given the economic damage that Turkey will suffer because of the war, economic links with the West are even more important. And from a Western perspective, there's more goodwill towards Turkey. But ultimately, this doesn't change, I think, you know, it doesn't affect the two underlying factors that prevent a much closer Turkey-EU relationship, and those are, on one side, the EU's concerns about the state of Turkish democracy, and on the other hand, the foreign policy differences between Turkey and several member states, mainly Greece and Cyprus. So as far as these two continue, I think we can have a better mood, we can have more informal cooperation, coordination, dialogue, but any kind of formal progress is going to be very difficult. And that includes pretty much all of the positive agenda that the EU set out last year. And I'll stop here and then happy to expand.
Thank you very much, Luigi. And I would like to continue this topic with you, Meltem, because as you mentioned at the beginning, I mean, EU-Turkey relations is one of your specialities. So it would be good to hear if you share Luigi's analysis of how the war has impacted on Turkey-EU relations, or if you have a different insight. And what you would like to see from the EU next in terms of its relationship with the EU, given all that's happened?
Well, I'll try to be brief in the sense that what I see happening between Turkey and the EU is that, this is more or less a dead relationship. It's frozen. It's not going anywhere. I think it died a long time ago, but nobody has the courage, basically, on either side to say that this is dead. Now, I think the first thing that we need to do is to acknowledge that, and this is, of course, not going to be music to, Turkish and some European ears either. Once we acknowledge that, a lot of things have changed from 2005, even 1999 onwards, with regards to the possibility of accession, with regards to the EU itself. I think the EU has changed, significantly as well, not only, Turkey-EU relations. So I think the first thing we need to do is to go beyond the actual, probably membership perspective, and to discuss, what kind of a new animal we actually have. The positive agendas, we've seen multiple positive agendas in the past. So last year's positive agenda, I don't think is basically including anything new or positive. But the crisis now, I think, has the potential, the Ukrainian war has the potential to at least alert both parties that there are, significant convergence of material interests, both in security-wise, with regards to their economic cooperation. There is, I think there is that revelation. Now, what does that revelation then lead to is another question. It's not going to be the revitalization of the accession process. It's not going to be, losing Turkey. If you look at it from the EU perspective, I think, Turkey was lost and now it's being regained. But in this, regaining part, I think the tools and the instruments that we need to identify now is the building blocks of a new relationship. So what kind of a new relationship, what would these building blocks of that new relationship will be, I think are all up for, currently a source of discussion. And nobody has actually taken the initiative to restructure that particular debate along this route. So in terms of, very quick question, very quick answer to your question on the Turkish EU relations and the way it's impacted in from the Ukrainian war, is the fact that it revealed that we are indeed, very important partners, and that our partnership needs to have now a new version, a new rhetoric that needs to underline new areas of cooperation. Turkey's strategic objective is and will always remain to be a member of the European Union. But while the EU is changing in so many ways with the British exit, what is now happening in this fast-track membership to Ukraine, if it realizes, I think it's also going to have a significant impact on the new debate as well. But the basics of it, nobody is yet, talking about that.
Thank you, Meltem. Just on this issue of the geopolitical awakening, because there's a lot of talk about the EU's geopolitical awakening since this war began. Do you think this geopolitical awakening could actually sort of strengthen cooperation in security and defense terms between Turkey and the EU? I mean, up until this war, I mean, there was a lot of criticism about Turkish drones. That's disappeared now. But there was also, regular narratives about Turkey being, a malign actor in the Western Balkans. and elsewhere. This, I mean, I think this sort of narrative has slightly changed now. But I mean, do you think that in terms of looking at partners to strengthen security ties with, which is something that was actually mentioned in the recent strategic compass, it would be realistic to think that this dialogue can, well, dialogue is one thing, but they can go beyond dialogue. I mean, we know they have these revitalized high-level dialogues, but is it possible to go beyond that and stop seeing Turkey as a malign actor, if this makes sense?
Well, to be honest, we've been here before. So when the RRF was adopted in 2000, and when it was just launched in 2003 in Macedonia first, and then later on in Bosnia, Turkey did play a very important role in at least contributing to the European defense policy at the time. And Turkish geopolitical position has never changed. So we were always, where we are. Our geography more or less is a constant. And it was also given in terms of the fact that the Middle East, Western Balkans, Caucasus were always going to be highly unstable places, and the European Union always, without a question, needed cooperating with the Turkish government and to do something with Turkey. The fact that now it's more closer to the European geographical space because of the war in Ukraine just underlined what we've been saying, for a very long time. In any case, I think European security, needs to have a, very solid cooperation scheme with Turkey, but same thing for for Turkey as well. So it's a mutually beneficial interaction. But I don't think the EU, to be honest, and my fellow panelists can jump in probably on that much better than I can. I don't see the EU changing into a into an actor that prioritizes geopolitics. Once this crisis is over, I think it will be back to normal to a certain extent. I don't see the EU acquiring, due to internal factors, internal divisions between member states, the ongoing tensions between different cleavages inside the European Union. Once this crisis passes over, I am doubtful whether the European Union will continue to acquire, more visibility as some kind of an international actor which prioritizes geopolitical concerns.
Thank you. Sorry, I just have trouble unmuting. Maybe I can ask you to follow up on this issue, Ian, in terms of whether you see the EU as shaping up to be a better geopolitical actor, able to engage more with, let's say, middle powers such as Turkey, without always considering the issue of democracy and human rights, or whether you expect the EU to remain a sort of geopolitical dwarf, as some people have said. And just a follow on to that, when we come back to NATO, I mean, in the past, I mean, even quite recently, up until this war, I mean, there was still a lot of murmurings how Turkey was a very annoying NATO ally, that Turkey, may leave NATO. Some member states would like to see Turkey leave NATO as well. Has this totally changed now? Has Turkey sort of, doubled down on his NATO membership and is viewed in a more positive and useful light than perhaps hitherto?
Yeah. Well, Amanda, thank you very much. I mean, not to be too flip about it, but just to say that, NATO by its very construction has lots of annoying allies. I mean, annoying, my own country until quite recently was perhaps put in that category by many people. And there are others, quite apart from Turkey at the moment, who might be put in that category as well. It's a consensus-based organization, and it's just not easy on that basis. But of course, what's happened in Ukraine has concentrated minds enormously in the alliance. I mean, the position of NATO as an actor is now enormously elevated for very understandable reasons. There are tremendous investments that are going to be coming along in terms of defense. The US is fully committed to the alliance. It's a strong point for a kind of a point of strength for NATO, really. This is clearly not what Russia wanted. Now, what does that mean for Turkey? I think it relates to this question we were discussing earlier and the points Meltem was making about, she didn't use the term strategic autonomy, but the whole question of the European Union developing its own enhanced capacity and using it more actively in the world. I think that will be coming. And I think now, given what's happening in terms of the confrontation with Russia, it's taken on a much more practical quality. So in other words, it's not just a philosophical debate about strategic autonomy anymore. It's really a practical question of what Europe will spend, what it can do, what it will do together, what it will do in a transatlantic frame, etc. If you have capacities, if you have capabilities in this space, you will be more valuable. Turkey has lots of them. So I think from the point of view, it won't change perhaps the long-term trajectory of Turkey's relations with the European Union vis-a-vis candidacy, but it could easily, if you talk about privileged partnership or whatever you want to call it, a positive agenda, a strategic relationship between Turkey and the European Union, there will be much more to talk about under these conditions. If I just a final point, I mean, Meltem, I absolutely take your point aspirationally about when this crisis is over. But I venture to say, even allowing for the differences in ages on this panel, this is not going to be over in our lifetime, in the sense that there could well be a negotiated settlement over Ukraine. There could well be a ceasefire. There could be well be a kind of end to this immediate, to the war as it is now. But in terms of the confrontation with Russia and what Europe will need to do and Turkey will need to do to meet that challenge, I think we're looking at generations here, not barring some radical political change in Moscow, which we might all hope for, possible. But without that, I think we're in a rather different world. And it's been the past couple of decades that have been the anomaly in this respect, relatively benign. I'm afraid I'm rather pessimistic on that score.
Yeah, I'm rather pessimistic as well. Ian, I mean, the world has changed forever, quite honestly. I mean, we can't go back to how we were before the 24th of February, yeah? And nobody actually knows how this conflict is yet going to end and what the impact of it's going to be. But now I would like to come back to you, Luigi, and I would like to remain on this issue of security and defense cooperation between Turkey and the EU, and also within this framework of the strategic compass and strategic autonomy. I mean, do you see any realistic opportunities for further enhancing ties in this area, whether it would be in, related to Ukraine or in the Black Sea region or in other parts of the world?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I think in terms of formal participation of Turkey in EU defense initiatives, that will remain difficult because of the problems that we all know. But so that includes initiatives where it would make sense for the EU to have Turkey, like the PESCO military mobility project, for example. But I think that would require a different Turkish government, and then perhaps the EU's calculation would change. But at the moment, I see that as quite unlikely. In terms of more, just if we're talking about coordination and things that don't actually require formal mechanisms, then I think it's far more likely that the new positive mood that has been created by just the shared awareness of this new monumental and generational threat from Russia and just generalized change in the security environment, I hope it can spark on both sides at least this a sort of cooperation instinct, where in places like Libya, there can be a greater willingness to actually think about, look, maybe we do share an interest in having a more stable Libya where we can both do business, and therefore, how can we actually work towards that goal? And I think in this regard, the fact that we seem to be having a détente between Turkey and France is going to be very helpful. It's also, possible to imagine much closer cooperation, of course, when it comes to Ukraine, not least between Turkey and many of the EU's eastern member states, and the Balkans. That's come up before in our discussion. There I think there's perhaps been a bit too negative an image of Turkey's influence in the Balkans. Ultimately, Turkey does support the EU and NATO membership aspirations of the countries there. So there's space for cooperation. There are areas, however, where it will remain quite difficult. So in Syria, for example, where the EU is not really a very important actor, and it's the US that's the most relevant one. Well, their cooperation remains extremely difficult because Turkey is still backing the YPG, and Turkey, the US is still backing the YPG, and Turkey considers that as part of the PKK. So, well, when it comes to US-Turkey relationship, that's still going to remain an enormous issue, and it will remain so in the case of the EU as well. But I also want to hit on the point that Turkey's more constructive attitude in its neighborhood towards countries like the UAE, towards Israel, and towards Egypt and even Armenia, that's something that perhaps can be built on. Turkey, one of the reasons why it's been so hard to cooperate with the EU in foreign policy has been this perception that it is an assertive, revisionist, and unconstructive power. If that changes, then I think there's more space for cooperation with the EU, because ultimately that depends on what the member states think. If their perception becomes slightly more positive, that can be a positive thing.
Okay, thank you, Luigi. Now I want to sort of get into a bit of Turkey's domestic politics now. So I'm going to come back to you, Meltem, to ask you how is this war perceived in Turkish, within Turkish society? I can read the Turkish newspapers, and there seems to be a lot of, pro-Russian disinformation that's floating around. So to what extent are Turks impacted by this sort of disinformation? And how is the West's response as well seen? I've seen, members of the Turkish government complaining about the West's response, doing not enough in the past, even though Turkey, is part of that sort of group. So what is the impact domestically? Also ahead of the elections. Turkey has elections next year.
Okay, point number one is that there is no one Turkey. So we discussed this before with you in a number of occasions. There are multiple Turkeys. So it depends on which Turkey you're looking at, or which group you're looking at. And within the larger Turkish society, there is a variation, exactly like other European societies, in terms of the way they perceive the role that the United States plays in global and regional politics, the way that the European countries have a presence. And when you think about the EU in Turkey, it generally is either France or Germany. So there is a tendency to look at what the Germans or the French are doing. And there is, of course, a group of people who actually believe that, Russia could be entitled to what they're currently doing. So there is not one uniform, voice. There is no one uniform way of looking at what's happening in Ukraine. But I think there is, what is more important is not the direct security impact of it, but Turkey is going through a major economic crisis. In the last 12 months, there has been a significant drop in the Turkish currency. And what is going to determine the electoral results, or how the governing party will come out from the elections next year, is going to be more about economics rather than foreign policy or security. So we have to look into the possible impact that the Ukrainian war now is having on Turkish economy, if any. Is it making it worse, the current situation? Is there a window of opportunity that could actually be captured here? And the amount of interdependence between Turkey and Russia in economic terms, in terms of the Turkish imports of Russian oil and gas, as Ian have already mentioned, that's similar to Germany, but about 47% of Turkish oil and gas imports come from Russia. Around 70% of Turkish imports of wheat, food insecurity is there, come from Russia. Something like 4.7 million Russian tourists come to Turkey every year for their vacations, about 2.2 Ukrainians. And we also have, similar wheat imports, not at the same extent as Russia, but Ukrainian wheat also plays an important role. So the bottom line is this, take something as simple as wheat. For the Turkish diet, bread is an essential part of the Turkish diet. I'm just, trying to make, the possible impact of the war on the ordinary Turks' perception of what is happening much more clear in your minds. If the bread is going to become much more expensive or, even scarce due to the fact that we cannot, let's say, import wheat, that's going to hurt the governing party much more compared to what the Germans or the French are doing in response to Ukraine, because it's the everyday lives of the ordinary Turks that's now going to be impacted. In terms of domestic politics, then I would say the most important impact that the changing security structure, and I totally agree with Ian as well, this might actually be a major turning point for global politics now, very similar to what happened in 1989. You said the same thing, Amanda. But for the ordinary Turks, what is directly visible is how it impacts their daily lives, and their daily lives is impacted from these economic changes. So the election results, or the road to the next year's elections, I think is going to be largely determined by the economic fluctuations that we are experiencing now, and the subsequent shortages. Food shortages, for example, is something that people are discussing. And when the war began, one of the most pressing issues that was being discussed was the import of sunflower oil. Sunflower oil that Turkey used to produce significantly in the last decades is no longer being produced, and we buy it from Russia. So there's this, it's the shortage of sunflower oil that people talked about, rather than invasion of Ukrainian territory or Ukrainian sovereignty violation. So bottom line, domestic politics is linked to economic welfare, at least until the next, until the next elections. That's going to be much more important as an issue shaping the Turkish debate.
Thank you. I have to say that sunflower oil has also totally disappeared from the supermarket shelves in Belgium. And not only that, so we all have to start using rapeseed oil or something different. So I want to come back to you now, Ian. Maybe we can touch a bit on the security implications for Turkey. I mean, the security impact, but also in the Black Sea region more broadly, because already Black Sea security was in a pretty desperate state before this war kicked off, and now it has significantly deteriorated. I mean, we've heard the stories of the amount of mines that have been put into the Black Sea, and that's probably only the tip of the iceberg. So how do you see this playing out for Turkey? I mean, the impact on Turkey, and what more could be done by NATO and other partners at this point to double down on Black Sea security?
Well, Amanda, thank you. I mean, you're right to characterize the situation in the Black Sea the way you did, and I mean, of course, the situation we have now makes it much worse. Looking ahead, I can't imagine a situation in which Turkey finds itself as, in fact, more of a security arbiter in the Black Sea than it is even today. Historically, Turkey has been one of the countries, along with Russia, actually, that felt that Black Sea security was for Black Sea states to determine. Basically, was uncomfortable with a lot of external presence in the Black Sea. It goes back to the point Luigi was making earlier about the effect of implementing provisions related to the passage of warships in a time of war in the Montreux Convention. I mean, it's a constraint on everyone, in fact, except for Turkey. And so, I can imagine with the way things are shaping up that Russia will find itself, I'm not sure it's going to be able to maintain that naval presence in the Black Sea for very much longer with what is being sent to Ukraine at the moment. And certainly it's not going to be very usable if it is. Who will have the military posture to actually be a security arbiter in the Black Sea and move in a relatively unconstrained way? It will be Turkey. And if that's Turkey as a NATO member Turkey, which it is, but a fully functioning one, that's very meaningful. If it's a Turkey that is very sovereignty conscious and doesn't want to act on behalf of NATO in the Black Sea, that will have another sort of meaning. I do think, this for many Turks probably is it's a crisis that crystallizes a lot of perceptions about the West, perceptions about Russia. There was a poll that was done recently, it's quoted in The Economist. I was just looking at the article here that suggests that something like 73% of Turks actually want the country to remain neutral in this war. And that when asked who was to blame for the crisis, a larger percentage of Turks actually blame NATO and the United States than they do Russia. But of course, that's in line with, the run of Turkish public perceptions in recent years. There's some new polling that's been done now, and GMF has been part of this. We're doing the launch. Forgive me a shameless pitch for this, but anyway, the launch is on Thursday. But it's very revealing. I mean, I don't think it'll surprise anybody, but there's maybe more interest in NATO today than there was for reasons we've already discussed. But the anti-Americanism clearly persists. And the desire to have a more balanced relationship with Russia in the public clearly persists. So I don't think, it's not going to be, I don't see this as Turkey, there is potential for Turkey to play an even more important security role, but it's also going to be politically constrained.
And do you think potentially, because this has already been discussed earlier, but Turkey, could they be a security guarantor for Ukraine? I mean, is there any traction in that?
It's an interesting question. I doubt Turkey alone could play that kind of a role, and I'm not sure anyone would want that. I don't even think Turkey would want that, to be honest, because that brings its own problems. But as part of a coalition playing such a role, one could perhaps imagine it. It's already been discussed. Would the Russians agree to such a thing? I can't imagine at this point, but it's if such a thing were in place, I could imagine Turkey contributing to it.
Okay, thank you, Ian. I have a final question for you, Luigi. Again, it's related to foreign policy. I mean, now that Russia is preoccupied, let's say, is this a sort of an opportunity as well for Turkey to enlarge its footprint in certain other theaters? I mean, I'm talking about in the South Caucasus, where Turkey has already strengthened its presence since the Nagorno-Karabakh war. In other parts of the world, including in Syria. I mean, Russia is using a lot of its own troops and capabilities from other theaters in Ukraine. So is this also an opportunity to Turkey to double down a bit on some of its foreign policy priorities elsewhere?
In short, I think so. I mean, as you've mentioned, Russia seems to be desperately looking everywhere for new fighters to bring into the war in Ukraine. Even in Libya, at some stage, there was mention that Haftar was being sounded out by Moscow in order to see if he could send some of his Chadian mercenaries to fight in Ukraine. And indeed, Wagner troops have been pulled out of many of these countries. So this does create an opening for Turkey to become more influential in any of those. I mean, in Syria, it also alters the balance slightly if Russia does become less powerful there in ways that can be quite escalatory in the short term. If there's no restraint on Syrian offensive towards the Turkish-controlled areas, that can create problems for Turkey in the short term. More broadly, I would hope that to the degree that there is a decline in Russian influence in these areas, and Turkey does take up the opportunity, then it does so in a way that's coordinated with the West. But this speaks to one of the themes that's perhaps been raised, and it is, to what degree does this conflict affect Turkey's positioning vis-a-vis the West? Because the EU is pursuing strategic autonomy, but in a sense, so has Turkey. Turkey's been pursuing its own form of strategic autonomy. And to what degree is it going to want to, and to what degree is it going to be able to, if the world is increasingly split into these two blocks and there's pressure on countries in the middle to align? I think that's one of the questions that we can't answer now, but we will have an answer to in the next few years and maybe even longer.
Thank you, Luigi. I now just want to put the two questions that we have here so far. First of all, from Jan von Herf, who has a question related to energy. He's asking what will be the role of Turkey in the reconfiguration of EU energy supplies, for example, the Eastern Mediterranean pipeline, other pipeline projects? What is the US role here, as different administrations took different positions on these in the past? So maybe you Meltem would like to comment on this, and this is a US angle as well. You as well, Ian.
I've seen the questions. It's the problem with the Eastern Mediterranean pipeline. This is something we've been discussing with Ian and the German Marshall Fund for the last 2 years or so, when we had the panels in Brussels before the pandemic, is that you need to find gas to have the pipeline to carry that gas. So one of the issues is with regards to the actual supplies in the Eastern Mediterranean and the cost of extracting these supplies. So that's a number one issue here. But at the same time, parallel to that, even if we can use the pipeline to bring in other gas, of course, it's there is a change, I think, in the Eastern Mediterranean, with what Luigi have already mentioned a few moments ago, that Turkey is now changing its foreign, well, it's reverting back to its pre-2009 foreign policy stance with Israel and Egypt before the Arab Spring again. So it's mending relations that have deteriorated in the last 12 to 13 years. And I think that's going to bring a new window of opportunity for both, for everyone that's involved in the region, to have more cooperative arrangements, and that could make an impact on the energy markets. It could make an impact on security in general. So that's my answer.
Amanda, if I might just add to that, I mean, I fully agree. And I would say that, this is going to concentrate minds in the energy security realm, just as it's going to concentrate minds on the security realm per se. I think, the resources will become more valuable. They are significant. They're not going to transform Europe's energy picture, but they can be very, very useful. And but a lot of it remains aspirational unless you have the right infrastructure, and the infrastructure is extremely expensive. So the problem really to date has been a lack of bankable projects. And there has been something of a cooling off in Turkish-Greek relations. We don't have the situation we had, say, 2 years ago or even a year ago. I think there will be more, and this is very much to the question, the thrust of US policy at the moment is to have more regional interconnectors to try to get beyond some of the political disputes that are standing in the way of having bankable projects. And obviously the big transforming factor here would be to have Turkey in these projects in a way that allows them to plug into the existing transport infrastructure in a very cost-effective way. And so there's a big incentive there to be able to do that. And it may be that things are now coming together in a way that will be more encouraging for it. I mean, against that, of course, you have to put the sort of declining, the reluctance to invest in new hydrocarbon projects. But, honestly, the current situation is also changing that picture.
Thank you, Ian. I'd now like to give the floor to Andre de Munter, who has a question. If he can be unmuted. Yep, Andre, you need to unmute yourself. Yep.
Yes, Amanda, I was in the process of doing that. Thank you very much. Good morning to everybody. Hi, Meltem. I mean, it's been ages. Last time, a couple of years ago, in the corridors of the European Parliament, I think. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for all your insights. I would also agree on facilitation rather than mediation, also because it is the term that we use in the EU for the efforts to encourage Kosovo and Serbia to fully normalize their relations. And I would say that this facilitation by Turkey fits into the overall picture also of upgrading its relations with the countries in the wider region, including the Middle East countries, and of course also as a maneuver to divert the attention from all the domestic trouble and the almost triple-digit in inflation. What I would like to do with my question is just to take you on a small excursion to the Western Balkans, because it has that I am also professionally dealing with. And it has been referred to by several of you. I mean, North Macedonia and Bosnia-Herzegovina and Western Balkans in general have been mentioned. As you know, there is huge and mounting pressure now on Serbia to align with the EU sanctions. I mean, despite its in itself already spectacular votes on 2 UNGA resolutions against Russia. So our narrative in the EU vis-à-vis Serbia is like, you cannot continue to sit any longer on 2 chairs. And there are almost weekly statements by the External Action Service now mounting that pressure. All the EU leaders that go to Serbia or in their telephone calls or whatever with Serbia are mounting pressure on that. So just suppose that it would come to this kind of tectonic shift, because that would really be spectacular, that after the elections now we had in early April with the new configuration in Serbia, that Serbia would at least partially align with the sanctions. Would you think that this would also lead to greater pressure on Turkey, despite the overall transactional nature of our relationship with Turkey now? So how do you look on at that? I mean, taking into consideration that despite the pessimism, which I by and large share on the future of our relations, in particular when the crisis or the war is over, how that would reflect on everything, taking into account that Turkey continues to be one of the 7, as we call it, enlargement countries. That would basically be my question. And then also I would agree on let's be vigilant about implementation versus circumvention, because when I was hearing that, I was also thinking of the Reza Zarrab case, you know, and by coincidence, he also has the Macedonian citizenship. I mean, this is also what we are looking at now with Bosnia-Herzegovina and Montenegro. I will finish there, because on paper, they are fully aligned, but there are blockages. I mean, it is, as it is the case with legislation, always about actual implementation. Sorry for being so long. Thank you.
That's okay, Andre. It's always nice to have you here and have your questions. And maybe I can just, add a final question here from my colleague, because it's also related to enlargement from my colleague Ricardo. And he's asking all the speakers whether they believe that this positive progress in Ukraine's accession process could undermine or revive Turkey's process. And can EU enlargement continue under the paradigm that existed before the 24th of February? So maybe we can go in reverse order this time, and I'll ask you to start, Luigi.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Just on Andre's question, I think ultimately it just shows how isolated Vučić is, and on the other hand, how much leeway EU member states are prepared to give Turkey right now. Perhaps also there's a different set of expectations. But ultimately, so even yesterday in the doorstep of the German Foreign Minister Baerbock, she singled out Serbia for not implementing EU sanctions. There was no mention of Turkey at all. So I think it just shows how different the perceptions of the 2 countries and their relative importance right now are from the EU's perspective. In terms of accession, I think it could go both ways. So of course, if Ukraine's accession goes forward, while on the other hand, Turkey remains completely stuck, especially if there's a new Turkish government that is, returns to a parliamentary system and so on, then that's going to create huge disappointment in Turkey. It was going to reinforce the perception that the EU is anti-Turkish, that it is Islamophobic, and ultimately it will push Turkey further away from the West. However, if, there's also a slightly different scenario, and here I would just point to the fact that the accession process quite quietly has subtly changed in relation to the Western Balkans, actually. So now the whole notion of phased accession, I don't want to overplay it too much, but it does exist. And so there's the notion that countries get closer to the EU gradually. They gradually get access to more and more EU funds, and they gradually get access to more and more parts of the single market. This blurs even more than is currently the case, the distinction between membership and non-membership. And I suspect as Ukraine's candidacy progresses, that's going to be more and more the case, that you're going to have things like extremely long transition periods. You might have even permanent derogations from the acquis, and all these things could make it easier and more likely that Turkey will get closer and closer to being an EU member as well?
Thank you, Luigi. I'll hand over to you now, Ian.
Amanda, thank you very much, and thanks for the question. I mean, I'm going to defer to my colleagues here on the sort of situation in the Western Balkans because they follow it more closely. I agree with what's been said. I do think the whole question of Euro-Atlantic integration, and here I would say even how this whole question is perceived from Washington, as well as what's on the table in Brussels, is going to have some new tests for sure. I mean, I do think the whole question of implementation of sanctions and, broadly speaking, posture towards Moscow is going to be part of the equation. I just can't imagine circumstances under which that changes, again, unless something changes very dramatically in Moscow. So I think that's absolutely on the table. I think as far as the evolution of Ukraine's own candidacy is concerned, I still remain somewhat skeptical. I'm not sure at the end of the day there is a lot of, or at least uniform European interest, EU interest in having Ukraine in. That said, I could easily see it following the path Luigi just laid out for us, which would be very important too, and supported by the United States, I would say as well. Would it make a difference for Turkey? Well, I mean, it could, this question is a very old one. If you have a different looking sort of EU, Turkey can fit in different ways. But I think ultimately now that's not so much a question of what membership looks like at the end, but rather, what kind of relationship you have in lieu of that or en route to that. And it is likely to include these things that we were talking about earlier, which is to say a lot more sort of geopolitical, geostrategic cooperation than might have been the case in the past in terms of the acquis, but it's a good question. I do think they're very different questions at the end of the day. I think Europe is looking at the Ukraine issue. I mean, there are deep issues of sort of, emotional mobilization and affinity and other things going on there, which have not been the case with Turkey. Quite the opposite, as I think Luigi was suggesting to us. So we'll see. Good, very good question to revisit in the coming years. So
absolutely, yeah. And I'll give the last word to you on this topic, Meltem.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Andre. And it was great, hearing you, if not seeing you. Now, I think the way, I'll just start with the Serbia-Turkey comparison. I think the way that the EU is singling out Serbia and expecting alignment from Serbia is an indication, and not Turkey, is an indication of the credibility of the accession process, that Serbia is still seen on the track for accession. And there is this expectation that it needs to act together with the European Union. And the fact that, Turkey is already a lost case in the sense that from the EU perspective, that it will not be expected to align at all to the EU positions, when such major cleavages appear, I think is illustrated from the fact that Serbia and Turkey are treated differently on these sanctions. In terms of Ukrainian membership, I don't think what the European Commission have started is that credible, in the sense that it just brings a positive incentive to the Ukrainian people to keep up the morale, probably, but it's going to be a very long process. Even if the Commission puts together the opinion, presents it to the Council, within the Council you're looking at a deep variation among member states with regards to the actual implications of Ukrainian membership. And if the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement negotiations give us a any initial glimpse into it, within the Ukrainian society, it's not going to be easy either. So I think that's just, and we also have to consider the implications of such a process on Georgia and Moldova, not only on Turkey, because then these guys will just say, well, what about us? We have a very similar agreement with the European Union. In terms of its impact or the possible impact on the Turkish accession process, there is already this, Luigi have pointed out, this very deep sense of resentment in the Turkish society and Turkish governmental circles towards the European Union. It will just, deepen and, make it even more visible. But I think the highlight, the major turning point for Turkish membership has already passed. I hope, I'm proven wrong, but it has already passed in 2003, 2004. And unless something happens, perhaps what happens in the Eastern Mediterranean could be a catalyst for it. Unless something happens over Cyprus, you know, the process cannot be revitalized no matter what Russia invades on the European continent. So I think that's, you know, a thorny issue on the side that we need to also talk about in a different format.
Absolutely, and I think it's a record that we managed to go 1 hour when Cyprus wasn't mentioned up until this point when talking about Turkey, and that's definitely a conversation for another day. So I have to close this meeting now. We've already run over 5 minutes, so I apologize to the audience for that, but I think it was really well worth it because we had a fascinating discussion with all three of you who are brilliant experts on this topic. So thank you very much for sharing your insights. I mean, Turkey is always going to remain an important topic of conversation for many different reasons. So I look forward to continuing conversations on this topic and many other ones related to Turkey. So thank you again for sharing your time with us. I wish you all a great afternoon, and thank you from the audience for joining us as well. So have a lovely afternoon, everyone.